Well, hello. It's lovely to meet you, and I'm sorry that I'm going to be doing most of the talking. I would love to hear you, but there'll be a little bit of time left at the end to do that. I understand that there's a very large contingent of Italians in the audience. To have a personal, private message, scusatemi se parlo in inglese. Non ce la faccio a farlo in italiano, ma se volete faccio I sottotitoli, così non... that was just to show off. Okay, I want to talk about being good. I'm the last person to advise anybody on being good, but it is a subject that I've thought about quite a lot in the past few years, and particularly in the context of how goodness applies to groups of people rather than to individuals, communities of every size, organizations, countries, cities, regions. And the reason why it's important to think about it in this context is because it's the most important thing in the world today. How good we are and how good we're capable of being will substantially determine our future. It's that important. So to start at the very beginning, how far back shall I go? Going back about 20 years, I first became interested in countries in the late 1990s because I was quite interested in how people perceived countries. It seemed to me that countries had images, and I rather foolishly coined a term, nation brand. I was being ironic. It's a bad idea to be ironic in an academic paper, because people often assume that you're being serious. But what I meant, ironically, was that in the age of globalization, every country is now competing with every other country for its share of what's available. And what's available? Tourists, investment, capital, the attention and respect of the public worldwide. And there are lots and lots of countries, and most of us know very little about them. But we have quite strong opinions on quite a large number of them. The poll that you did during the lunch break suggests that most people have pretty strong opinions about countries. And it occurred to me back in the 90s that a country's image, the way that it was perceived by ordinary people around the world, was a really important component in its competitiveness. Because at that time, I could still say the word competitiveness without stumbling or feeling embarrassed. I have a problem with the word competitiveness today. In fact, it's an interesting psychosomatic process that I'm so problematized by the idea of competitiveness that I can hardly say the word anymore. And every time I try to say it, it comes out wrong. But back in the 90s, competitive was a word that we all used all the time. And I was very interested in that relationship between national image and competitiveness. And I wanted to find some data. I wanted to find out what people thought about countries. I knew what the reality was supposed to be because that was very well researched and very well published. But I couldn't find anywhere any data, any polling data, about what ordinary people like you and me actually think about other countries, our own country, and the other 199 or 204 or whichever measure you use to count countries. So I thought it would be a good idea to start measuring it. And in 2005, I started doing a very large global poll, just an opinion poll, using about 1,000 men and women in about 28 countries, and just asking them a lot of questions about 50 countries. Simple questions about how they perceived those countries. I didn't care whether they knew or whether they were just guessing. In a sense, what I wanted to do was to do a survey of ignorance. I wanted to find out what people didn't know about other countries. And I called it, still convinced that I could use this word ironically, the Nation Brand Index. The reason I was using the word ironically, by the way, was because I was very sorry about the idea that nations seem to have been turned into products on the shelf of a gigantic global supermarket. And the idea that they had brand images, just as running shoes and mobile telephones have brand images, was an idea that made me rather sad and rather sorry, but that's the reality of globalization. That's the reality of competitiveness. And what people believe is more important than what they know, because they know almost nothing. As soon as I started running this survey, it started producing bizarre and unexpected results. One of the first things I discovered when I was asking people around the world what they think about other countries was that they don't. Most of the time, they don't. They don't think about other countries. I discovered after a little while that most of us, most of the time, only ever think about 3 countries. We think about our own country a little bit, not a lot. We tend to think about the United States of America because it's rather prominent in our lives. It has an impact on us in one way or another. And most of us think about a third country which varies depending on our interests and the context in which we're being asked the question. So some of us, for example, might say that the other country we think about is Uruguay because we're thinking of going on holiday there. Or we might say that the country we're thinking about is Russia because we're worried about what Russia is up to at the moment. That's it, 3 countries. Now, the last time I checked, there seemed to be 205 countries in the planet. So effectively, what that suggested to me was that 202 countries, to all intents and purposes, to the majority of the world's population, don't exist. They simply never think about them. And so they make do with a kind of cliché, a kind of brand image. Switzerland is clean and perfect. Sweden is clean and perfect, but a bit sexy. Sweden is Switzerland with sex appeal. Germany is terribly efficient, but rather dull and humourless. Britain is posh and boring, but gets things done. And so on and so on and so on. And we have these clichés in the backs of our minds where they remain more or less fixed throughout our lives, collectively. Individually, we might change them based on our personal experience, but collectively, we simply don't change them. They are part of the culture, those clichés. What British people think about the French is part of the British culture. And the second thing I discovered after running this survey for a couple of years was that actually I just created the most boring survey ever devised, because it simply didn't change. Nobody seemed to change their minds about other countries from one year to the next. At least not in a statistically significant way. Individually, of course, because somebody might go to Australia and fall in love with it, but the majority of people, the statistical majority, simply never changed their minds. So I thought, that's interesting. It looks as if national image is more like a fixed asset than a liquid currency that you can spend or expend. In fact, it's something that the country seems to be born with, and there's almost nothing you can do to change it. And I started running this survey in 2005, and I carried on doing it. Originally, I did it 4 times a year until I discovered how boring it was, and then I started doing it once a year. And I carried on doing it once a year until about 2011, and then I began to think to myself, this has now collected quite a lot of interesting data about how the world views other countries, and within that, there must be some interesting secrets. And I kept on finding the interesting secrets. I kept on discovering things without even meaning to. One of the things I do in the survey is I ask people some demographic questions. I ask them their age, their sex, their level of education, their income, and their religion. And so one day I thought, it'd be interesting, wouldn't it, to separate out people's answers about countries on the basis of their religion rather than the country they came from. And guess what I discovered? I discovered that the most popular, the most admired country in the world by Muslims, by an enormous margin, is the United States of America. In fact, the USA is more admired by Muslims than any other country is admired by any other self-declared religious group. So that's interesting, isn't it? And the more of this kind of analysis of the study I did, the more unexpected findings I discovered. So in about 2011 or 2012, I decided I would take a year out and I would try to find out the Holy Grail. For me, the Holy Grail was a very, very simple thing. It was, why do people admire one country more than another? Now, we know that with some of the big, powerful countries, the countries that have what Professor Joseph Nye calls hard power, in other words, the ones with the huge economies, the huge armies, the huge territories, the huge populations, we know that they obviously are going to have very powerful images. But the 180, 190 countries in the middle, why is it that people admire one of those more than they admire another? Why does the majority of the world's population admire Poland more than it admires Hungary when they know nothing about either? What is it? What are the drivers? So I took a year out and I developed a model which I called the Mars model, M-A-R-S-S. And the Mars model basically identified the 5 drivers of national reputation. Why was this important to do? Because national reputation effectively drives national performance. If you've got a good, powerful national image, then everything is cheap and everything is easy. If you've got a weak or a negative national image, everything is expensive and everything is difficult. It's very, very easy to persuade people to go on holiday to the French Riviera. It's relatively difficult to persuade people outside the CIS to go on holiday to the Crimean Riviera. And that's purely image. You can get just as nice a holiday in the Crimean, well, perhaps not right at the moment, but generally speaking in the Crimean Riviera than in the French Riviera. We have all kinds of these absurd prejudices about countries, which are cultural constructs and which are terribly, terribly important for the real performance of countries and their competitiveness. And so the Mars model told me the following, that these were the 5 drivers. The first one, M, rather surprisingly, is morality. Do I think this is a good country or a bad country? Now, I'll come back to that term good in just a moment, because it's rather a difficult term, and it has several meanings depending on which way you come at it. The A is aesthetics. Is it a beautiful country or an ugly country? Those of us who are sighted, we see the world very much in visual terms. If we think that a country is beautiful, its people are beautiful, then we assume that it must also be good and kind and nice and a generally speaking, a positive place to be. And if we think a place is ugly, or its people, or its buildings, or its cars, or its landscape are ugly, then we think it must be bad and wicked and evil. That's the way we work. We have a mental age, my friends, of about 7, collectively. And if you think I'm joking, I have actually checked that. I did a small and rather stupid survey a few years ago to try and estimate the mental age of the world's population. And it averages down to about 7. I'm not joking. This is actually really rather significant because it tells us something, doesn't it? It means, for example, one of the reasons why politicians often have so much trouble connecting with populations is because they don't know how to be 7. I'm not saying we're stupid, I'm just saying we're simple. And the simple things appeal in a way that politicians, with their vastly advanced mental ages, often can't even begin to remember. Anyway, so in that sense of aesthetics, that seems to be a really important driver of national image. The R stands for relevance. Is this a country that has some kind of impact, or potentially could have an impact, on my life, the world that I live in? I mentioned Uruguay earlier. Now, Uruguay is a great country. I happen to be very interested in it, but I probably don't feel that it has much impact on my life, because it's relatively small, it's relatively far away, and in the end, it's probably not very relevant to my life, at least not today. It might become so at some point in the future. China, on the other hand, Russia, America, Germany, those are countries which I feel are relevant, because what they do or what they fail to do has an impact on my life, directly or indirectly. The first S is strength. I mentioned Joseph Nye before. This is the equivalent of Nye's concept of hard power. A strong country in our imagination is one that has a big army. It's one that has a big economy. It's one that can impose its will on the international community, on other countries. And the second S, and the last element in the equation, is sophistication. The perception that a country is modern and technologically advanced, that they use electronics. If a country is perceived as being unsophisticated, we have an idea in our heads that people are still ploughing the fields with oxen. And that's important to us in most parts of the world. We like the idea of a country that's modern and that uses and develops technology. So that's it. Those are the 5 drivers of national image: morality, aesthetics, relevance, sophistication, and strength. And I did a little analysis to compare the relative strengths of those. And what I discovered, to my surprise and delight, was that the first one, morality, is by a huge margin the most important one of all. In other words, people prefer good countries. We, all of us around the world, are more interested in whether a country is good or bad, whatever we mean by that, than we are interested in the fact that it's weak or strong, or ancient or modern, or relevant or irrelevant. Isn't that extraordinary? It was, in a sense, just so much exactly what I wanted to discover that I didn't trust myself. And I got lots of other people to check the results, and they were very, very critical about the way that I'd done it, and tore up my model and started again, and did it the right way, and came up with exactly the same result, which was nice. So it really does look as if morality is the main driver of national image, and image is one of the main drivers of national prosperity. This is potentially very far-reaching in its consequences. It's sort of like corporate social responsibility. Companies discovered quite a long time ago that if they want to hang on to their customers and they want to sell more products, they've got to play a prominent and positive role in society. They've got to be good. Otherwise people won't buy their products. And it looks as if the same is true for countries, which is a really important discovery. But I was worried because it just seemed to be too good to be true. And then in the end I realized, I remembered that statistic that I'd discovered way back in the late 1990s, that people don't think about other countries very much. And suddenly I realized what I think the mechanism probably is. None of us, well, this audience accepted because we're very cosmopolitan and we're very highly educated, but the majority of the world's population doesn't like to think about other countries. They find it uncomfortable and difficult. They don't think it's relevant to their daily concerns most of the time. So a good country, a country that contributes something to humanity, is a country that you can safely ignore. You don't have to worry about it. I don't go to bed at night afraid that I'm going to be awoken at 3 a.m. by Norwegian terrorists standing around my bed. Perhaps I should, but I don't. And therefore Norway, which I perceive as a good country, because of the Oslo Peace Accord and various other nice things that Norway does around the world and in its neighbourhood, is a country I can safely ignore. I don't have to worry about Norway. But I do have to worry about Russia. And that seems to be the mechanism. So, what do we mean by good? Well, I use the word good as far as it's possible to use it, not in a moral sense. I don't mean good as the opposite of bad. I mean good as the opposite of selfish. A good country, according to the multiple definitions that I get from my study, is a country that seems to contribute something to humanity. It does something good outside its own borders. It's a country that doesn't just reflect the interests of its own citizens and its own population. It's a country that seems to care about the world in general. That seems to be the distinction. I use the word good because there just isn't a better word for it, even though it's a word that people get very upset by. So, last year, well actually 2 years before last year, I started work on the Good Country Index. And the Good Country Index is very, very different from the Nation Brands Index. The Nation Brands Index is a poll. It measures the opinions of the great 7-year-old out there. The Good Country Index, on the other hand, attempts to measure reality. It collects together all the available statistics, all the good, robust statistics about national performance, and tries to use them to calculate the contribution of each country to the rest of the planet. Should we feel glad that these countries exist? Are they doing something for us, for humanity, and for the atmosphere, and for the world generally? Now, in order to do this, I used about 35 different data sets, which mostly come from the United Nations. The UN is really the only one of the very few bodies that's large enough and has got the time and the energy and the money and the resources and the people to collect robust data about 125 countries, which was the number I ended up with. And it's an extraordinary thing, but there are hundreds and hundreds of surveys created. I've lost count of how many indexes of countries there are out there. It's a ridiculous number. Somebody should really do an index of indices so that we can figure out how many of them there are. But the interesting thing is that they almost all do the same thing. They measure the performance of countries in one way or another exclusively. They measure country performance as if those countries were islands, as if they were little private planets inhabiting their own private solar system. So all of the calculations are done completely without reference to anybody outside that country. And I'm sure that as economists, you're very well aware of the fact that the big debate going on in macroeconomics at the moment is this notion that you can treat economics, you can treat the flow of economic value as if it were inexhaustible. Of course it's not. We live pretty much in a zero-sum game here. There is, last time I checked, only one planet Earth. We all live on it, and therefore it is effectively a closed system. And in the age of globalization, a very, very high and increasing degree of interconnectedness between all of those countries. And so the idea of measuring national performance country by country by country, with a split, a gulf in between each country, as if none of them had any impact on any other, is a really odd thing to do. And so I thought, it's around about time somebody had a stab at measuring not what countries do to themselves, but what they do to everybody else. And that's what the Good Country Index tries to do. And it produces some predictable results and some surprising results. Perhaps the most surprising result to many people was that I divide the results by GDP, by the way, because I wanted it to be as far as possible a level playing field. I didn't want countries with big searing at the top of the list as the greatest contributors, because the absolute contribution per country doesn't interest me. What interests me is what countries contribute as a proportion of what they have available to contribute. So you divide the results by GDP, you mash together the 35 data sets, and what you end up with is the surprising fact that Ireland is the goodest country on the planet. I say goodest as opposed to best, because best is something different. Best is a value judgment. Goodest just means in terms of what it contributes in 7 different general areas of culture, of human development, of economics, of peace and security, and all kinds of little criteria like that. You can check it out yourselves. The website is www.good.country. I have one of those new top-level domains. There's no com. It's good.country. It's rather cool. You can go there and you can see for yourselves, and you can examine the data sources and see how it comes about. The ones that you thought were the top 3 are not in the top 3. The United Kingdom and Sweden and Switzerland do score reasonably high, but all 3 of those lose significant numbers of points, because in 2010, which was where most of the data came from, that was the most fresh data I could find last year, they were all busy exporting enormous numbers of weapons around the world. And that's not good, is it? They also killed quite a lot of people. And you can call me old-fashioned, but I think killing people is wrong. And I try not to make too many subjective judgments about whether the dead people were good people or bad people, because it's always going to be a little bit subjective. Yeah. This is it's a very delicate ethical area. But in the end, one is faced with a choice. Either you start making subjective judgments about whether it's better to kill a Swedish soldier or a Taliban, or you just say, no, I'm going to make no judgments whatsoever. Let's just say that killing people is wrong. Yeah. So it's very, very difficult ethical area. When I noticed that only one person here said that the United States was the goodest country on earth. This would not be the result we got if we were running this poll in the United States. And it may have been tactless of me to release this index on Independence Day, with the United States coming 21st in the ranking, but I got a phenomenal amount of hate mail from young American males who have been brought up to believe that their country is the greatest contributor to humanity in history, bar none. And it may be true, I don't know, who am I to say, but it also does a lot of harm because it's a very big country with a lot of international interests. And like Sweden, like Switzerland, like the United Kingdom, it exports a lot of weapons, it does a lot of killing, it does a lot of polluting, it does a lot of bad stuff as well as a lot of good stuff. It takes with one hand and gives with the other. Net, if you're in the top 50, then it's a reasonable assumption that you're not a free rider on the global system, that you are giving more than you take. But I would like to draw your attention to a couple of other interesting results just very quickly before I move on from the survey. One of my favorite results was the fact that Kenya came in the top 30. It was number 26, if I recall correctly. And this to me was a really important finding because it suggests that this is not about money, that you don't necessarily have to have a large economy in order to be able to do good for humanity and the planet generally. It suggests also that the data sets that I was using were reasonably effective in avoiding that trap of making it all just about money. So what's it all about? Why did I do this? Well, I certainly didn't do it because I'm a good statistician. I'm a very poor statistician. And I certainly didn't do it because I think that the world needs another index. As I've already suggested, it really doesn't. I also didn't do it because I like numbers. I hate numbers, and I'm very unhappy and not at all at home with numbers. The reason I did it was because I wanted to try to get the point across that we've been evaluating countries in the wrong way for far too long. And the way in which that we look at the world today is very, very old-fashioned still. We live, as I said before, in the age of globalization, where we're living in a single, very substantially connected system, and where the majority of the challenges that we face, whether that's climate change or refugees or demographic problems or narco-trafficking or nuclear proliferation or landmines or human rights or pandemics, whatever global challenge you look at, every single one of those challenges is now way beyond the ability of any single country to be able to tackle. If one single country tries to tackle one of those problems and they succeed, it'll just pop up somewhere else. These are now global systemic problems. And this has been one of the great, sad achievements of globalization, that it has very quickly and very effectively globalized all the problems. They're now just everywhere. And we have not been quite so quick at globalizing the solutions. In some areas we've done very well. But the real problem, it seems to me, is that the cause of most of those challenges are you and me, the 7 billion people currently living on the planet. We're at fault. We're the ones who've done it. And if we want to change, resolve, tackle any of those big issues, it's got to be us, the 7 billion, that change our behavior. But organizing and marshalling such a gigantic number of people, 7 billion people, is an almost unthinkably difficult task. Where would you start? How could you possibly do it? Well, obviously with nation states, because for the time being, the 7 billion are still organized within nation states. And they have governments, democratic or otherwise, that have legislative power over their own populations. And 205 nation states, that's a number one can deal with. You can't really deal with 7 billion, but you can deal with 200. The United Nations does it every day. But the trouble is that those nation states are still behaving in a way that they were taught to behave 200, 300 years ago. In other words, they're competing against each other, and they're programmed to compete against each other. And the politicians that we elect them in order to compete more effectively against other countries. 200, 300 years ago, that competition was martial competition. It was about killing other people. It was about taking their territory. And we brought up generation upon generation upon generation of young men to believe that the nation state was so important that one should feel proud to die for it. What a piece of nonsense that was. But we brought up so many generations of young men to believe that it was somehow noble to terminate your own existence for the benefit of this imaginary construct called a nation. Of course, that wouldn't have worked on its own. So we made it work by brainwashing all their wives and mothers and girlfriends and fiancés to believe that they should encourage the young men to want to die for the benefit of their nation state. And so it was a complete, perfect system which enabled absolutely rampant competitiveness between nations. And we still haven't lost that habit. Today, it's economic competitiveness you see, I told you I can't say that word anymore. Competitiveness most of the time. Some of the time, it's still military competitiveness. But we're still competing against each other. We're still doing that really simple, really basic, really childish thing of trying to steal progress from each other. And this has got to stop. There's a point of maturity, a point of development in individual people as well as in humanity and in the nation state, where competitiveness must give way to cooperation and collaboration, because that is the more mature, the more effective, the more intelligent, the more rational, the more pleasant way to behave. And that's where we need to go. My time is up. I'm just going to leave you with what I regard as the conclusion to all of this thinking. What we need is we need a new mandate for our leaders. Whether those leaders are national politicians, city politicians, regional politicians, or indeed whether they're the management teams of the corporations that we work for, we need to give them a new mandate. At the moment, They have a very simple single mandate. We've elected them or chosen to work for them on the basis that they have a single mandate. They have to look after us, their citizens, and they have to look after our territory, our little slice of the world's surface. This now must change. We must now get the message across to all of our leaders that from now on they have a dual mandate. They are responsible for their own citizens and for every man, woman and child on the planet. Yes, all 7 billion. They're responsible not just for our own slice of territory that we temporarily inhabit, but for the entire surface of the terrestrial globe and the atmosphere above it. Yes, the whole world. Now that may sound ridiculous if you're a politician. You may think I've got enough trouble looking after my own population, let alone looking after every man, woman and child on the planet. I'm not saying you have to prioritize them equally. But what I'm saying is the culture change that must take place is one where it becomes inadmissible to have any conversation, to make any policy, to make any decision without bearing in mind its impact on the rest of the world and the rest of the planet. And I believe we can do this because we've done it before. We did it with racism and we did it with sexism. 20 years ago, it was still commonplace, even in so-called developed countries, for governments to sit down and have meetings about policy and accidentally make racist and sexist comments, demeaning other races, demeaning other sexes. Today, not only would you lose your job for doing that, you'd probably go to prison for it. And that's been an important change. What I would like to see is the same cultural change when it comes to nationalism. That in 2 years or 5 years' time, if you accidentally make a nationalist remark and you accidentally talk about competing, you talk about foreigners as if they were either enemies to be neutralized or customers to be ripped off, then you are guilty of a misdemeanor that should result in you losing your job. That's what I would like us to see. And the way that we're going to achieve it is by going from now on to our leaders every day with the same message. I don't want to live in a successful country anymore. I don't want to live in a happy country. I want to live in a good country. And that's the message that we have to start giving. Thank you.